New York City, a ballroom, 400 people in their finest, crystal chandeliers, white flowers. The kind of room that costs more per night than most people make in a year. At the podium, a woman in pearls is speaking French. Her voice is warm, confident. The voice of someone who has never once imagined being caught. At a table near the left aisle, a woman in red is listening. She has been listening for 3 years. The woman at the podium smiles in her direction, says something that makes half the room raise their glasses. The woman in red sets down her water, stands up, walks toward the stage. The broom shifts, a man halfway to his feet, a hand on his shoulder. Pressing him back down, she reaches the microphone, adjusts it, looks out at 400 faces and begins to speak in perfect French. The flowers arrived every Monday, peonies, white ones, $60 a stem, delivered before 7 in the morning by a man who never knocked twice. They went in the crystal vase by the front window. The one Naomi was not allowed to move. She had tried once, shifted it 3 inches to the left because the morning light hit it wrong and made the whole entryway feel cold. Dorothea noticed before lunch, moved it back without saying a word. Just looked at Naomi the way you look at a child who has touched something that does not belong to them. Naomi never moved the vase again. That was year 1, this was year 3. She knew the difference now between what she could touch and what she was simply meant to stand next to. The dining room held 14 chairs. Naomi sat in the one closest to the kitchen, not because anyone assigned it them. Because the first night she had reached for the chair nearest the window, the one with the good light and the view of the street, and Devlin had pulled out the kitchen chair for her with a smile so natural she almost believed it was kindness. It was not kindness, it was architecture. The table was set for 8 that Thursday evening. White linen, heavy silver, the good crystal that Dorothea brought out when someone worth impressing was coming. 2 of Devlin's college friends. A business associate named Harlan Webb, who wore his money the way some men wear cologne, too much and in all the wrong places. And Harlan's wife, a woman named Constance, who had not looked directly at Naomi once in 3 years of dinners. Not once. Naomi had counted them. Dorothea sat at the head of the table in a cream blazer and a single strand of pearls she described as understated and everyone else understood as a declaration. She was 62 and looked 50 and knew it and used it. Her voice carried the particular authority of a woman who had never once in her adult life been told no by someone she respected. She was speaking French. She always spoke French at dinner when guests came. It started, officially, as a nod to the family's wine import history, their long relationship with Bordeaux suppliers, their brand positioning as a house of refinement and global taste. That was the official version. Naomi knew the real version. The real version was that French was a wall Dorothea had built around her table so that certain conversations could happen in plain sight, in plain hearing, with no consequences at all. Because the woman at the kitchen side chair didn't understand French. That was the assumption. That had always been the assumption. And Naomi had fed it carefully from the very first dinner. A small confused smile when the language shifted. Eyes that went slightly distant, the way eyes do when sound becomes noise. Never too obvious, never performed. Just enough to make the assumption feel confirmed. Just enough to make them comfortable, and comfortable people talk. Dorothea was talking now. Her voice low and warm the way it got when she was enjoying herself. She was telling Harlan something about the new Atlanta distribution push, about the brand repositioning, about how the market research had pointed them toward a certain kind of face, a certain kind of image. She paused, let her eyes drift to Naomi. Then she smiled at Harlan and kept going, still in French, her voice not even dropping to a whisper because why would it? She said, some tools are beautiful and some tools are useful. The best ones manage to be both, at least for a while. Harlan laughed. Constance touched her pearls. Devlin reached for his wine and Naomi Carter, in her black dress with the low back and the perfect posture, picked up her fork and cut into her salmon. Her right hand was steady, her left hand under the table pressed flat against her thigh, and 3 fingers tapped. Once, twice, 3 times. A habit she had developed in month 2. Something to do with the part of her that wanted to respond. The part of her grandmother had told her to keep quiet and keep counting. Not yet, the tapping said. Not yet. She had been born in the Tremy neighborhood of New Orleans, in a house that leaned slightly to the right and had done so for as long as anyone could remember. The porch steps were uneven. The kitchen window stuck in summer. The water heater made a sound every morning like it was clearing its throat before deciding whether to cooperate. None of that mattered. What mattered was the books. There were books everywhere in that house. Stacked on the kitchen counter, piled by the front door, tucked under the coffee table and on top of the refrigerator and along the hallway in careful rows that Naomi was not allowed to disturb. Most of them were in French, some in English. a few in a language that turned out to be Italian, which Naomi wouldn't understand until she was 19, but which she used to read aloud as a small child because the sounds felt good in her mouth. Her grandmother, Diane Carter, had come to Louisiana from a small town outside New Orleans with one suitcase and a language, and the absolute certainty that the language was the more valuable of the two. Diane taught Naomi French the way other grandmothers teach children to pray, not as a lesson, as a way of being. Every meal was in French, every bedtime story, every argument about unfinished homework, and every quiet conversation after the lights were supposed to be out. By the time Naomi was 6, she was dreaming in it. By 12, she was reading Zola and correcting her grandmother's grammar, which Diane pretended to find irritating, and actually found to be the greatest joy of her life. Howard University came next, a full scholarship, French literature with a minor in international business. She graduated with honors at 22, and spent 2 years afterward teaching literacy in Louisiana parishes, learning Italian from a woman in her building, picking up Spanish from a church group that met Thursday evenings and fed everyone afterward. 4 languages by 28. 5 if you counted the Creole she dreamed in. Then she met Devlin Ashford at a charity gala in Atlanta on a Saturday night in October, and she thought she had met the person she was going to build a life with. She had met a business decision. She just didn't know it yet. Devlin was charming in the specific way of men who have been told their whole lives that they are charming. He laughed at the right moments, asked questions that sounded like interest and functioned as research. He was handsome in his tuxedo and attentive in his way, and when he looked at Naomi across a room full of people who all wanted something from each other, he looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking for years. She found out later that he had been asking a question, just not the one she thought. The board of Ashford Wine Group had been pushing for 2 years toward a repositioning, new markets, younger demographics, the exploding buying power of black consumers in the South and the Northeast. The research was clear, the opportunity was real, and the family's public face, which had always been Devlin, was good but not sufficient. He needed a partner who read as authentic, as grounded in the community they were trying to reach, as beautiful in a way that photographed well and felt aspirational without feeling distant. Dorothea had, according to sources Naomi pieced together much later, described the ideal candidate in a board presentation as a woman who could open doors we cannot currently reach. Naomi Carter had been recruited. She had believed she was being loved. The distinction took her 8 months to understand, and then another 2 years to decide what to do about it. The prenuptial agreement had been 12 pages. Her attorney at the time was a general practice lawyer named Ronald, who worked out of a 2-room office in Decatur, who charged $300 for the consult and spent 11 minutes on the document before telling Naomi it looked standard. She had signed it. She had not read it. She had been 29 years old and in love with a man who held her hand during the signing and told her this was just a formality, just paperwork, just something the family's attorneys required of everyone. Everyone. As if Devlin Ashford had a string of previous wives. As if this were policy and not precision. She moved into the mansion in November. By December she knew something was wrong. By February she knew what it was. By April, the first month, she caught every syllable of a French conversation she was not supposed to understand. She had made a decision. She had gone to the drugstore on the corner of Lexington and 73rd and bought a composition notebook. Dark blue cover, college ruled. She had brought it home and put it in the box she kept under the loose floorboard beneath her side of the closet. Behind the winter coats no one ever moved, and she had started writing. Not feelings, not pain, dates, times, names. Exact words in French transcribed as precisely as she could manage. English translation beside each one. The name of whoever had been in the room. The context. Whether there were any other witnesses. A record. The kind that could survive a courtroom. The composition notebook was now one of 6. She had started a 7th in January. The birthday dinner happened in March. On a Thursday, 72 people in the Ashford Foundation's private dining room at a hotel in Midtown. Naomi wore a deep burgundy dress. Off-shoulder. The kind of dress that made people look twice and then pretend they hadn't. She had spent an hour on her hair. She looked by any honest measure stunning. Dorothea did not mention the dress. Dorothea did not mention Naomi at all until the speech. The speech came after the main course and before the cake, in that window of warmth and wine when a crowd is softened and ready to be told how to feel. Dorothea spoke for 11 minutes. In English for the first 8. About the Ashford legacy, about Devlin's leadership, about the family's commitment to excellence and community and the kind of vision that gets built across generations. Then she switched to French. She looked out at the room. Most of the room did not speak French. Some did. The ones who did were the ones Dorothea was performing for. She said, and of course my daughter-in-law, Naomi, who joins us here as she always does. Our family is generous. We have always opened our doors. Not everyone who walks through them understands the rooms they've entered, but we are patient. That is our nature. She smiled at Naomi across the room. Naomi smiled back. Perfect. Still, warm, but something broke that night quietly in the back of Naomi's chest. Not the cruelty itself. She had made her peace with the cruelty. What broke was the ease of it. The way Dorothea said those things in front of 72 people with the absolute confidence of someone who had never once imagined being caught. That confidence, that specific, inherited, unearned confidence, that was the thing Naomi decided she would dismantle. Not quickly, not loudly, carefully. The way you take apart something that was built to last. She went to the bathroom after the speech, locked the door, sat on the edge of the marble sink counter and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she called her grandmother. She spoke in Creole, low and steady, the language of their kitchen and their arguments and their late nights and their love. She said, not yet, but soon. Her grandmother said, I know, baby, I know. Neither of them said anything else. That was enough. 2 weeks after the birthday dinner, on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled like rain, Devlin left his laptop open on the kitchen counter and went to take a shower. Naomi walked in to start coffee. She was not looking for anything. She genuinely was not looking. But the screen was right there, and the email was right there. And the name on the email was the name of the family's lead attorney. A man named Bernard who had been with the Ashford family for 23 years and who had once, at a dinner party, described himself as their institutional memory. The email was dated 8 months before the wedding. Subject line, prenuptial execution strategy. The body of the email was 3 paragraphs. Naomi read all 3 in the time it took the coffee maker to heat up. The first paragraph discussed the structure of the asset protection clauses. The second discussed the evidentiary standard for coercion, and how to ensure the signing could not later be characterized as coercive, even though the intent was to ensure the subject had minimal opportunity to seek independent review of the terms. The third paragraph was the one that stayed with Naomi. The third paragraph said she doesn't need to understand the terms, she just needs to sign. She doesn't need to understand, she just needs to sign. Naomi stood in the kitchen and read it again, then a third time. Then she closed her eyes and stood there for a moment, very still, while the coffee maker finished heating and the rain started outside and Devlin's shower kept running. Then she opened her eyes, poured herself a cup of coffee, walked to the window, looked out at the rain. There are moments that divide a life before and after, not the dramatic ones, not the ones you expect to matter, the quiet ones, the Tuesday morning ones, the ones that find you in your own kitchen, holding a coffee cup, realizing that the story you have been living is not the one you thought. Naomi Carter had believed, somewhere deep and stubborn, that her marriage was complicated, difficult, the product of a controlling mother-in-law and a man who loved his family more than he sometimes loved his wife. She had stopped believing that on a Tuesday in March. She had understood, in the time it took to read 3 paragraphs, that there was no complicated, there was only deliberate, and she had a decision to make. She could leave, or she could stay long enough to make sure that when she left with everything. She chose to stay, and she went to the closet that evening and opened the 7th composition notebook, and she started a new section. Reginald Farnsworth arrived on a Wednesday in April, flying in from Atlanta the way he always did, carrying himself the way men do when they have made enough money to stop performing it. He was 58, broad-shouldered, the kind of presence that made rooms rearrange themselves slightly. He had built the Southern distribution network for Ashford Wine Group over 15 years, turning what had been a niche import operation into something that moved real volume in real markets. He was, by every meaningful measure, the reason the Ashford brand had penetrated the communities it was now trying to use Naomi to reach. Dorothea treated him like an employee. He had never corrected her. The dinner that Wednesday was a working one. 6 people at the table. Naomi at her chair by the kitchen. Dorothea holding court. Devlin presenting numbers that Reginald already knew and had already run himself and had found 2 errors in that he chose not to mention yet. Dorothea spoke English for most of it. Switched to French when she wanted to say something to Devlin that she considered above the level of the table. Which included, at one point, a comment about the advisability of bringing Reginald further into the company's strategic planning, given that his utility was in execution rather than vision. Execution rather than vision. Naomi watched Reginald's face. He did not react, not a flicker, not a tightening around the eyes. He simply reached for his water glass, took a sip, set it down, and for just a second his eyes met Naomi's. She did not look away. Neither did he. After dinner, the group moved toward the front sitting room for cognac and the kind of conversation that exists to fill the time between business and departure. Naomi excused herself and stepped out to the balcony. The night was cool, New York in April. She stood with her hands on the railing and looked out at the street below. She heard the balcony door open behind her. She knew it was not Devlin. Devlin never followed her outside. Reginald stood beside her, not close, just there. He looked out at the same street for a moment before he spoke. He spoke in French. Not French the way Dorothea spoke it, not French as a wall or a performance or a way to exclude. French the way it sounds when someone simply speaks it because it is the language that fits the moment. He asked, "How long have you understood?" Naomi did not turn, did not hesitate. She said, "Since the first night." Silence. Not an uncomfortable one. The kind that happens when two people have arrived at the same understanding from different directions and are taking a moment to appreciate that. Then Reginald said, "I thought so when." She made the comment about the vase at the September dinner. The one about marble belonging in museums, not in the hands of people who don't know what they're looking at. You touched your necklace, but your eyes didn't change. You'd already processed it before your body reacted. Naomi looked at him. He was still looking at the street. He said, "I've been watching this family for a long time, Naomi, and I've been watching you for about a year, waiting to understand what you were doing." She said, "And now?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My brother built this company's southern presence. Network by network, relationship by relationship, 15 years of work. He was let go with an email, 17 lines, no severance, no acknowledgement of what he had built. They rebranded his entire network under the Ashford name and called it Innovation." He finally turned and looked at her. He said, "I didn't re-sign my distribution contract last year because I needed the business. I signed because I needed to be in the room when it happened. And I think it is about to happen." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. She said, "What makes you think that?" He said, "Because you're still here. And women who know what you know and feel what you clearly feel do not stay unless they are building something." She did not confirm it. She didn't need to. She looked back at the street. The door opened behind them. Devlin's voice calling Reginald back inside. Something about the shipping logistics for the fall quarter. Reginald straightened, adjusted his jacket. He said quietly, in French, before he turned, "When the time comes, I want you to know you won't be standing alone." He went inside. Naomi stayed on the balcony. The street below was ordinary. Cabs, a dog walker, two people arguing outside a restaurant 3 floors down, their voices carrying up in pieces too small to be understood. She stayed there for a while. Then she went inside, poured herself water, said goodnight to the room in a voice that gave nothing away, climbed the stairs, walked past the master bedroom, went to the closet, opened the 7th notebook, wrote down everything, the date, the time. What Reginald had said in French, exactly what she had said. What had not been said but had been understood. Then she wrote, at the bottom of the page, in the small, careful handwriting she used for entries that mattered, "He knows. He's ready. So am I." She closed the notebook, placed it back in the box, went to bed, lay in the dark next to a man who was sleeping easily, the way people do when they believe they are in control of everything around them. Naomi looked at the ceiling. She thought about her grandmother's hands, the way they moved when she wrote, the way she held a pen like it was something with weight and consequence. The way she had sat across from Naomi on the night before she left for Howard. Both of them at the kitchen table with the window open and the sound of the neighborhood coming in, and said, "A language is a door. Don't show them which ones you hold." All these years, she had held them, every single one, and the doors were all still there, waiting. Margaret Tibbs had worked in the Ashford mansion for 12 years. She had arrived the September after Dorothea's first husband died, and had stayed because the pay was reliable and the work was structured, and because, she had told her sister on the phone once, some houses just need someone steady in them even when the people running them are not. A small town outside Huntsville. She was 60 years old and had a lower back problem that flared in cold weather, and an opinion about everything that she kept mostly to herself because she had learned, long before the Ashfords, that a woman in her position could observe almost everything if she simply kept her mouth shut and her eyes open. She had observed quite a lot. She had watched 3 years of dinners where Naomi sat by the kitchen door and said the right things, and smiled the right smiles, and never once appeared to understand the language being spoken around her. She had watched Dorothea dismiss Naomi with the particular thoroughness of a woman who had decided early that this person did not count. She had watched Devlin look at his wife with the expression of a man who has chosen convenience over honesty and found ways to live with that choice. She had watched all of it. She had not said anything, because it was not her place. Because she had children to help support and a mortgage that was almost paid, and because standing up in houses like this one, in her experience, cost more than it was worth. That had been her calculation. Until the evening in April when she was in the hallway outside the study, stacking fresh linens in the linen cabinet, and heard Dorothea on the phone with Bernard. Dorothy's voice was not loud, it was precise. The voice she used when she was giving instructions she expected to be followed without question. She said, "I want the filing ready to move the moment the contract closes. And I want the custody argument in the draft. Use the birthday incident. Use the January situation. Use whatever you can find that makes her look unstable. I want it airtight, Bernard. I want a judge to look at that filing and not see a woman. I want them to see a liability." A pause. "Then I don't care how long it takes to find it. Build the narrative first and find the evidence to match. That is what I pay you for." She hung up. Margaret stood in the hallway with a stack of linens in her arms. She stood there for a moment, then she put the linens in the cabinet, closed it carefully, walked downstairs to the kitchen, where Naomi was standing at the counter looking at something on her phone with the focused stillness she sometimes had, the one that Margaret had always thought was composure, but was starting to think might be something else. Margaret stopped in the doorway. Naomi looked up. Margaret said, "There are some things I've been watching for a while, and some things I heard tonight that I cannot pretend I didn't hear." She crossed the kitchen, sat down at the island without being invited because she was 60 years old and her back hurt, and she was about to say something that was going to cost her something, and she was going to need to be sitting down to do it. She looked at Naomi. She said, "I have been in this house for 12 years. I have seen a lot. I haven't said anything about most of it because it wasn't my fight and I have my own life to protect. But I'm telling you right now, what that woman just said on the phone to her lawyer, about you, about building a case out of nothing, I am not willing to pretend I didn't hear that, I'm not willing to be in this house and know that and say nothing." She put her hands flat on the counter. She said, "I don't have recordings, I don't have documents. What I have is 12 years of watching and a very clear memory of exactly what I heard tonight, and if you ever need someone to stand up in a room and say what goes on in this house, I will do that." The kitchen was quiet. Naomi looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measures something, the kind that comes from years of having to decide quickly who is telling the truth. Then she said, "Why?" Margaret said, "Because I'm from Alabama, and I have been watching women get handled by people who think they're invisible for my entire life. And I am too old and too tired to keep watching it and call myself someone who did the right thing." Naomi held her gaze. Then she nodded once. She said, "Okay, just that, okay." But there was something in the word that Margaret felt more than heard, something that had been building for a long time and was now finally beginning to move. She got up, put her hands on her back, said she'd finished the upstairs linens. She went back to work, and behind her in the kitchen, Naomi Carter opened the notes app on her phone and began to type. That night she went to the closet, the 7th notebook. She wrote for 40 minutes. At the bottom of the last page, she wrote 3 names: Adrienne Monroe, whose name she had been given 6 months ago by a Howard classmate, who had called her the most precise person in any courtroom she had ever been in. Desmond Wells, whose byline she had been reading for 2 years, whose investigation into financial fraud in the luxury import industry she had clipped and kept in the same box as the notebooks. And Reginald Farnsworth, who had stood beside her on a balcony in April and said the thing she had been waiting 3 years for someone to say. She had the record, she had the witness, she had the partner, she had the journalist, even if he didn't know it yet. What she needed now was an attorney and a room, the right room, with the right people in it, with Dorothea standing in front of a microphone, speaking French in the absolute certainty that the woman at the edge of the room could not understand a word. She knew exactly which room, the Ashford Foundation annual gala, 60 days. She closed the notebook, put it back, looked at herself in the mirror inside the closet door, 32 years old. Howard Honors graduate, 4 languages, 6 notebooks, 3 years of patience so complete it had started to look from the outside like weakness. From the outside. She turned off the light, went to bed, and for the first time in a long time she slept without waking up in the middle of the night. Because there is a particular peace that comes when you stop waiting and start moving. She was moving now and she was not going to stop. The call to Adrienne Monroe lasted 7 minutes. Naomi had taken it in the car, parked 2 blocks from the mansion. Engine running, windows up, because the house had ears and she had spent 3 years learning exactly which walls were thinner than they looked. She had found Adrienne through a Howard classmate named Portia, who had gone through her own high-asset divorce 4 years ago and come out the other side with her apartment, her retirement account, and a settlement that her ex-husband's attorney had called unconscionable, and Portia had called Tuesday. Portia had said, "If you need someone who does not lose, call Adrienne Monroe. She's in D.C. She will fly to you. She does not do phone consultations for cases like this because she says you can't read a client through a speaker. But call her anyway. Tell her Portia sent you. She'll pick up." She had picked up on the second ring. Naomi had talked. Adrienne had listened. And somewhere around minute 20, after Naomi had laid out the prenup, the offshore account emails, the recordings she had made of conversations she had been present for, the 7 composition notebooks, and the approximate timeline of the divorce plan she had overheard, Adrienne had gone very quiet. Not the quiet of someone processing. The quiet of someone who has just seen the shape of something and recognized it. She said, "You've been documenting since month 2. Naomi said month 1. "I started in month 2, but I backdated the first entries from memory. Everything I could recall with specificity, dates, words, context." Another pause. Then Adrienne said, "New York is a one-party consent state. You were present for every conversation you recorded. The documentation is admissible. The prenup has grounds for challenge because you signed without independent counsel, and the other party's attorney has, in writing, described the intent to limit your opportunity for review. That email alone is significant. The offshore accounts, if we can trace them, open a fraud argument that changes the settlement math entirely." She paused again. She said, "How much time do we have?" Naomi said, "They're moving the divorce filing to coincide with the close of a major distribution contract. I have maybe 60 days. Possibly less if Dorothea decides to accelerate again." Adrienne said, "I'll be in New York Thursday. Do not move anything. Do not change anything in the house. Do not give them a single reason to say you're the one who disrupted the status quo. You have been invisible for 3 years. Stay invisible for 60 more days," Naomi said. "I've had practice." Adrienne said, "I know. That's why I'm taking this case." Thursday came. They met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far enough from the Upper East Side that no one Naomi knew would wander in. Adrienne Monroe was 44 and wore a charcoal blazer and had the kind of stillness that comes from being the smartest person in most rooms and having decided years ago to stop announcing it. She ordered black coffee, did not touch it, opened her laptop and did not look up for the first 6 minutes while Naomi talked. When Naomi finished, Adrienne looked up. She said, "The prenup is the foundation. If we can prove fraud in the inducement, that they concealed assets and deliberately ensured you had no meaningful opportunity for independent review, the entire document becomes challengeable. Not just portions of it. All of it," Naomi said. "Ronald spent 11 minutes on it." Adrienne said, "I know. I pulled his bar record this morning. He handles traffic violations and small estate matters. He had no business touching a document of this complexity, and the Ashford attorneys knew that. They likely knew it before they handed it to you." She turned her laptop around. The screen showed a spreadsheet. Column headers, numbers. She said, "These are the offshore transfers you forwarded to your secure account. 4 months of records. There are 2 accounts, one in the Cayman Islands, established 14 months before your wedding. One in a private trust structure that we will need a forensic accountant to fully trace, but the preliminary pattern suggests regular transfers beginning shortly after the company's West African distribution deal was finalized 3 years ago." Naomi looked at the numbers. She said, "He told me we had 1 house and a good salary." Adrienne said, "He told you what you were supposed to know." She closed the laptop. She said, "Here is what I need from you. I need you to continue behaving exactly as you have been. Go to the dinners. Smile at the right moments. Do not access anything new on his devices. Everything you have already forwarded, I have. Everything going forward comes through legal channels." "Can you do that?" Naomi said. "I've been doing it for 3 years." Adrienne said, "I know. But it is different now. Now you know the end game. And the hardest part of what you're doing is going to be the next 60 days. Because you know. And they don't know you know. And that gap is everything." She picked up her coffee finally, took 1 sip. She said, "Do not close that gap." Naomi drove home. She parked in the garage. Sat in the car for 3 minutes. Then walked in through the kitchen entrance the way she always did. With her keys in her hand and her expression set at the particular calibration she had developed for this house. Present but not threateningly so. Aware but not observably so. Beautiful in a way that read as ornamental. It was the most demanding performance of her life, and she had been doing it without applause for 3 years. 60 more days. The weeks that followed had a specific texture. Careful, measured. The texture of someone walking across a floor they know is sound but are choosing to test 1 plank at a time anyway. Naomi went to the Tuesday dinner. She went to the Thursday dinner. She attended the foundation committee meeting with Dorothea and said 4 sentences and smiled 8 times and came home and wrote down everything Dorothea had said in the car on the way there about the gala, about the guest list, about the importance of the family's image at a moment of significant business transition. Business transition. That was the phrase Dorothea used. It meant the Africa contract, which meant the divorce was coming right behind it, which meant Naomi had less time than she thought. She called Adrian from the car again. Same 2 blocks from the house. Engine running. She said she used the phrase business transition at least 4 times today. I think the contract is closing sooner than we estimated. Adrian said, how much sooner? Naomi said, I don't know. Weeks, not months. Adrian said, I'm calling Desmond tonight. Naomi said, is that the right time? Adrian said, it's the necessary time. There's a difference. Desmond Wells had been covering financial fraud in the luxury goods and import industry for 11 months when Adrian Monroe called him on a Thursday evening in May. He was 41. Worked for a newspaper whose name appeared at the top of front pages that people still folded and carried and argued about over coffee. He had a voice that sounded like a man who had spent years learning to be patient in rooms where people were not telling him everything. He had not been waiting for Naomi. He had been waiting for this story, and those are not always the same thing. But sometimes they converge. He had his own file on Ashford Wine Group, had built it over nearly a year, cross-referencing customs records, SEC disclosures, and the kind of anonymous sourcing that comes from people who have been wronged by a company and are no longer willing to stay quiet, but are not yet willing to be named. He had the structure of the fraud. He was missing the interior. Someone who had been inside the house, who had seen the actual mechanism of it, who could speak to the deliberateness of what the Ashford family had constructed and was not going to be dismissed as a disgruntled business partner or a former employee with an axe to sharpen. He needed someone credible, documented, unimpeachable. He needed someone who had been in the room. Naomi had been in the room for 3 years. They met on a Saturday morning. A park in the West Village, benches, people with dogs, the particular weekend morning ease of a city that is briefly not in a hurry. Desmond arrived exactly on time, sat across from her, did not bring a recorder, did not bring a notepad, just himself, in a gray jacket, with the focused attention of a man who understood that first meetings are about trust, not information. He said, Adrian tells me you have documentation. Naomi said 6 notebooks, 3 years of recorded conversations with transcripts, financial records forwarded from internal communications, a former employee willing to testify. He looked at her, He's why you doing this now? She said, because they're about to move. He said, and if they weren't? She was quiet for a moment. She said, they were always going to move. I just needed to be ready first. He nodded slowly. He said, I have to be honest with you. My story is not about your marriage. My story is about financial fraud in a company that has been misrepresenting its asset structure to distribution partners and misusing brand equity built by people who were never compensated for building it. Your marriage is context. It is significant context. It is the most human and legible part of what this company has done. But I can't promise you the story centers on you. Naomi said, I'm not asking it to center on me. I'm asking it to be accurate. He said, what does accurate look like to you? She said, it looks like the truth. The whole thing, not just the fraud, not just the money, the way they used people, the way they decided who counted and who didn't, the way they built an empire on a foundation of treating certain people like furniture. Something shifted in his expression, not pity, not discomfort, recognition. He said, I can write that story. She said, then write it. They sat in the park for another hour, not exchanging documents, not going through notebooks, just talking. The way 2 people do when they are deciding whether to trust each other with something that matters. By the time they stood up to leave, they had not shaken hands or signed anything, but something had been agreed. The kind of agreement that doesn't need paper because both people understand exactly what it costs. Devlin heard Naomi on the phone that same week. Not the call with Adrian, not the meeting with Desmond, a different call earlier when Naomi was in the upstairs sitting room and had not heard him come back from the gym earlier than expected. He had stood in the hallway for 40 seconds before she noticed him. She was talking to her cousin in Atlanta about a family dinner next month. Completely ordinary, nothing to hear. But he had heard enough to hear her voice carrying an energy he didn't recognize. Something focused, something that wasn't the particular tone she used in this house. He didn't say anything to her about it. He went downstairs, poured himself a drink, and at dinner that night, he mentioned, carefully, to Dorothea, in French, while Naomi was in the kitchen getting water, that he had heard Naomi on the phone. that she had seemed more animated than usual, that he wasn't sure it was worth noting, but he thought Dorothea should know. Dorothea set down her fork. She said, "Who is she talking to?" He said, "I don't know. I only caught a few seconds." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It doesn't matter. Whatever she thinks she's doing, she has no resources and no connections in this world that matter. She has a lawyer from Decatur and a grandmother in Louisiana and a Howard degree that qualifies her for nothing that would threaten us." Devlin said, "You're not worried?" Dorothea said, "I am accelerating the timeline. The contract signs in 3 weeks. I want Bernard ready to file within 48 hours of the signature. I don't want her in this house past the end of June." Devlin said, "And the gala?" Dorothea said, "The gala is in 4 weeks. She will attend. She will stand where she always stands. She will smile and understand nothing, and the last image of her in this family's public life will be exactly as it has always been. Decorative, harmless, forgettable." She picked up her fork again. She said, "Let her make her phone calls. It won't change anything." Devlin nodded, poured himself more wine, and in the kitchen, Naomi filled her glass with water, stood at the sink, looked out the window at the darkened garden below. She had heard every word. She had not moved, had not changed her breathing, had not altered the pace at which she filled the glass. She had simply listened and noted, and understood that Dorothea had just given her the one piece of information she had not yet confirmed. The contract was signing in 3 weeks. The gala was in 4, which meant she had the sequence. Contract closes, divorce filed, and before any of it becomes public, before any of it can be shaped by the Ashford attorneys and the Ashford narrative and the Ashford version of events, there would be a room, a large room, with cameras and journalists and 400 years of combined influence sitting in folding chairs listening to Dorothea Ashford speak French to a woman she had decided didn't count. 4 weeks, she carried her water back to the table, sat down, smiled at Devlin. He smiled back. Neither of them meant it. But they were both very good at the performance by now. The hardest days were the ones that looked easiest. The dinner party the following Friday, 12 people, Harlan Webb again, and Constance, and a new couple Naomi had not met before, friends of Devlin's from college who were in from Chicago, and who were perfectly pleasant and completely outside all of this, and who kept trying to include Naomi in conversations she was allowing herself to appear only partially engaged in, because she could not afford to be remarkable right now. She could not afford to be interesting or impressive or to give anyone at that table a reason to look at her and think, that woman is more than she's been presented as. Not yet, so she laughed at the right moments, offered opinions that were warm but not sharp, asked questions that made the person she was asking feel seen without requiring her to reveal anything about herself. It was exhausting, not the way lifting is exhausting. The way holding still is exhausting. When every muscle is engaged in preventing movement and nobody can see the effort, because the whole point is that it looks effortless. She drove home from that dinner and sat in the car in the garage and let herself feel it for exactly 5 minutes. All of it. The weight of 3 years of careful stillness. The particular loneliness of being the most informed person in every room she entered and having to pretend otherwise. The grief of it, which she had never fully named but which was there. For the version of this life she had believed she was building. For the version of Devlin she had thought she was marrying. 5 minutes. She set a timer on her phone. When it went off, she got out of the car, went inside, made tea, opened her laptop, and started cross-referencing the financial records with the timeline Adrian had built, looking for the pattern that would make the offshore account argument impossible to dismiss. She found it at 12:40 in the morning. A transfer, $43,000. Moved to the Cayman account 4 days after the signing of the West African distribution deal, which would have been, if she was reading the timeline correctly, 11 days after their wedding. 11 days. She stared at the number. Then she forwarded it to Adrian with a single line, "Look at the date." Adrian replied at 6:15 the next morning, "I already did. This is the one." The gala planning had been underway since January. The Ashford Foundation annual event was the family's biggest public moment of the year. 400 guests. A ballroom at a hotel in Midtown that cost more per evening than most people made in a year. Press, board members, distribution partners from across the country. The kind of room that existed to remind everyone in it that the Ashford name meant something. Naomi had attended 3 of these galas. At the first one, she had worn the dress Dorothea selected for her. Dark green, tasteful, invisible in the way that things are invisible when they are designed not to draw attention. At the second one, she had worn navy at Dorothea's suggestion, and had spent most of the evening in a corner near the bar listening to a board member's husband talk about golf. At the third one, the previous year, She had worn a deep wine-colored dress she had chosen herself, and Dorothea had said, in French, on the car ride over, that some women confuse being seen with being appropriate. She had written that one down too. This year, Naomi bought the dress herself. She did it in the second week of May. Went to a boutique in Soho on a Tuesday morning alone. Spent 45 minutes trying on things that were not it before she found the one that was. Red. A red that did not apologize for itself. Fitted through the body, draped across the shoulder, the kind of cut that did not require jewelry because the dress was already saying everything it needed to say. She bought it, brought it home, hung it in the back of the closet behind the winter coats, next to the box with the notebooks. She thought that was appropriate. Celeste Ashford found her on a Wednesday, not sought her out. Found her, in the way that happens when someone has been circling something for a long time and finally runs out of reasons not to say it. Naomi was in the library, a room she used in the afternoons when the light was good and the house was quiet. Working through a stack of distribution contract documents she had requested from the filing cabinet that Devlin had never locked because it had never occurred to him she would be interested. Celeste appeared in the doorway. 29 years old, smaller than her mother, quieter, in the way of people who have spent a lifetime in the presence of someone louder and more certain, and have learned to take up less space as a survival mechanism. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, "Can I come in?" Naomi looked up, said yes. Celeste sat down in the chair across from the desk. She was not looking at Naomi. She was looking at her own hands, turning her ring around on her finger, the way people do when they are trying to decide how to start. She started in the middle. She said, "I know about the divorce filing. I've known since February. Mom told me because she wanted me to be prepared for the family optics, and because she needed me to understand why certain things were going to happen." Naomi said nothing. Celeste said, "I also know about the custody argument, the instability narrative. I know Bernard has been building a file for months. I know about the gala plan. The idea that she gives her usual speech and you stand in the room the way you always have, and that's the last image. The quiet one. The one that confirms the story they've been telling about you." She finally looked up. She said, "I didn't say anything because I was scared, because Mom controls everything, my apartment, my trust distribution, my place in this company. And I told myself it wasn't my business and that you'd be fine and that the settlement would be fair enough." Her voice caught. She said, "I don't believe any of that anymore." Naomi looked at her. Not with warmth exactly, with something more measured. The look of a woman who has learned to take nothing at face value but is choosing in this moment to listen without deciding. She said, "What do you want, Celeste?" Celeste said, "I want you to know that what's happening is wrong. And I want you to know that I will say that if I am asked directly and officially." Naomi said, "That could cost you." Celeste said, "I know." Naomi said, "It probably will cost you. She will not forgive it." Celeste said, "I know that too. I've known it since February and I've been trying to find a version of this where it doesn't, and there isn't one. There isn't a version where I do the right thing and come out fine. I just have to decide if that matters." Naomi was quiet. Then she said, "I'm not going to tell you what to decide, but if you decide to say something, say it to an attorney, say it in writing. Say it in a format that cannot be walked back later." Celeste nodded. She stood up. She said at the door, "For what it's worth. I have always thought you were something they never deserved to have in this house." Naomi said, "I know." Celeste left. Naomi sat for a moment. Then she added Celeste's name to the document she was building. Not as an ally exactly, as a variable. One that had just shifted. Desmond called her the following Monday. He said, "I need to tell you something about where the story is." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I have been working this beat for 11 months. I have sources inside 3 distribution companies who have confirmed irregularities in Ashford's asset reporting. I have a former employee who was willing to go on record about financial misrepresentation in the West African deal. I have the customs records and the SEC disclosures and 6 months of pattern analysis." He paused. He said, "What I have been missing is the interior, the mechanism, the person inside the house who can speak to the intent, not just the outcome." Naomi said, "And now?" He said, "Now I have that. And I have a question about the gala." She said, "Ask." He said, "I'm going to be in that room. I have press credentials through the paper. I'm going to be at table 7 with a photographer. If something happens, something public, something on the record, I will be there to cover it. But I need to know from you, is something happening?" Naomi said, "Something is always happening at the Ashford Foundation Gala. It's a room full of powerful people performing their own importance." He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "That's not an answer." She said, "No, it's not." A pause. He said, "Okay, I'll be at table 7. She said, "Where's something you can move in? The speeches run long." She hung up, looked at the wall. 3 weeks, the contract would close in 3 weeks, then Dorothea would file them. And before that filing could shape the story, before Bernard's narrative about instability and unsuitability could get traction, there needed to be a counter-narrative, one that was true, one that was already in print, already on record, already part of the public conversation before any court document could frame it otherwise. That was the sequence. That had always been the sequence. She had just needed all the pieces to be in position. The week before the gala, Naomi called her grandmother. She drove to the park, the one in Brooklyn she had started using for calls that mattered. Parked, sat with the engine off this time, window down. Late May in New York, which is one of the few times New York remembers it can be gentle. Diane answered on the third ring with the particular warmth of someone who has been waiting for the call without wanting to say so. They talked for an hour, not about the gala, not about the filing or the attorney or the notebooks or Desmond Wells at table 7. They talked about New Orleans, about the summer Naomi was 9 and learned to make étouffée and burned the first batch so badly that Diane had opened all the windows and laughed until she had to sit down. About the morning Naomi had gotten her Howard acceptance letter and Diane had not cried, had simply held the letter for a long time and then said, "I always knew." In French. Of course in French. They talked about the porch that still leaned to the right. They talked about the books, and near the end, Diane said, in Creole, in the language that had started everything, "You sound different." Naomi said, "Different how?" Diane said, "Settled, like something in you has found the ground." Naomi looked out at the park. She said, "I think it has." Diane said, "Are you scared?" Naomi said, "A little, but not of them." Diane said, "Then what?" Naomi was quiet for a moment. She said, "Of what comes after. I know how to do this part, the watching, the waiting, the building. I've had 3 years of practice. What comes after is something I haven't done yet." Diane said, "Living in the open?" Naomi said, "Yes." That Diane was quiet. Then she said, "It is harder than the other thing. I won't tell you it isn't. Being seen costs something, always has. But it costs less than staying hidden." Naomi said, "Okay." Diane said, "You've been carrying this a long time. You can put it down after next week." Naomi said, "Not all of it." Diane said, "No, not all of it, but enough." They stayed on the phone for a few more minutes, not saying much. Just the sound of each other's breathing and the distance between New Orleans and New York that had always been smaller than geography suggested them. When Naomi finally said goodbye and hung up, she sat in the car for a while longer. 1 week. The red dress was in the closet. The notebooks were in the box. Adrian had the prenup challenge ready to file. Desmond had his press credentials and his photographer and table 7. Reginald had confirmed he would be in the room. Margaret Tibbs had given Adrian a written statement signed, notarized. 12 years of observation reduced to 4 pages of very specific, very damning clarity. Naomi had spent 3 years building a case in 6 composition notebooks in a box under a loose floorboard. She had spent the last 60 days making sure that case had legs, that it could walk into a courtroom and stand up, that it could walk into a ballroom and speak. 1 week. She started the car, drove home, walked in through the kitchen entrance the way she always did, put her keys on the hook, smiled at Devlin, who was at the counter with his phone. He said, "Good drive?" She said yes. He went back to his phone. She went upstairs, opened the closet, looked at the red dress for a long time, touched the fabric once, closed the closet. 7 days. And she was ready. The dress was red, not the red of something trying to be noticed, the red of something that had decided a long time ago that it did not need permission to exist. Naomi stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself for exactly 1 minute, not with vanity, not with doubt. Just the necessary act of seeing yourself clearly before you walk into something that will ask everything of you. The dress fit the way it had in the boutique in Soho, fitted through the body, draped at the shoulder. The kind of cut that does not need embellishment because the line itself is the statement. Her hair was straight, black, falling past her shoulders without fuss, long and dark and hers. 1 pair of gold earrings, small ones, the ones her grandmother had sent 3 years ago in an envelope with no card, because Diane Carter believed objects should speak for themselves. Naomi looked at herself one last time, then she picked up her bag and walked out. Devlin was in the foyer in a navy suit. He looked at her when she came down the stairs and something moved across his face. Not admiration, something older. The expression of a man who has been holding a story about someone for years and has just encountered evidence that the story was always wrong, but who is not ready to say so. He said, "You look different tonight." She said, "I'm wearing red." He said, "That's not what I meant." She said, "I know." She walked past him to the car. Dorothy arrived at the hotel before them. Of course she did. The ballroom was Dorothy's room the way every room was Dorothy's room. She had claimed it before anyone else arrived and would hold it until she chose to release it. The space was everything it always was: crystal, flowers, the particular shimmer of a venue paid for at a level that erases all evidence of effort. 400 guests in their best versions of themselves, moving through the room with drinks and the ambient awareness of who was watching whom. Naomi walked in and the room did what rooms do when someone enters and refuses to be small. It noticed, not all at once, the way a current shifts underwater, a few heads turning, a pause in a conversation, a glance that lasted longer than social courtesy required. Because this woman had been in this room twice before, in navy and wine. Background colors, appropriate colors. Colors that said, "I am not the point of this evening." Red said something else entirely, and the room, without knowing why, felt the difference. Dorothea saw her from across the space. One fraction of a second. A tightening around the eyes. The compression that happens when something unexpected enters a situation you believed you had controlled completely. Then it was gone, replaced by the face she wore at events. Open, gracious. The face of a woman who has never been surprised by anything because she arranges in advance for nothing to surprise her. She turned back to her guests. Naomi found her table, ordered water, and looked across the room to table 7, where Desmond Wells sat in a dark jacket, his photographer 2 seats down, both of them doing the specific kind of nothing that journalists do when they are paying attention to everything. Their eyes met for half a second. He gave her nothing visible, just a slight stillness, an acknowledgement invisible to anyone not looking for it. She looked away. Reginald appeared beside her 20 minutes into the cocktail hour, not making a production of it, just arriving the way he always did, with the ease of a man who has chosen his position and does not require anyone's permission to hold it. He said, "You ready?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I'll be where I need to be." She said, "I know." He moved on, worked the room, warm and unhurried, because the most dangerous thing you can be in a space like this is comfortable. And tonight, Reginald Farnsworth wanted everyone in this ballroom to feel very comfortable. Right up until they didn't. The speeches began at 8:30. 2 board members first, a video presentation. The kind of programming that is professionally assembled and emotionally generic and exists primarily to create the expectation of a conclusion. The conclusion was Dorothea. She took the podium at 8:52. Cream gown, the pearls, the posture of a woman who has never once walked to a microphone unsure of what she was going to say. 8 minutes of English, the Ashford legacy, the family's vision, the foundation's impact. All of it true in the technical sense that facts can be arranged to tell a story that isn't. Then she switched French. The pivot so practiced it read as natural, as refinement rather than exclusion, as the language of culture, rather than the language of a wall, built specifically to keep one person out of the conversation happening right in front of her. Dorothea spoke about the company's positioning, their global reach, their commitment to excellence across generations. And then she looked out at the room with the sweep she always used, the one that took in everything and landed eventually on the woman in red near the left aisle. She said, in French, and of course, "My daughter-in-law, Naomi, who joins us as she always does. Our family is generous. We have always opened our doors. Not everyone who walks through them understands the rooms they've entered, but we are patient people. It is our nature. And so she sits among us tonight, smiling, understanding nothing I am saying, and honestly that is probably for the best, She raised her glass slightly, an invitation. Half the room raised theirs, and Naomi Carter stood up. Not fast, not performing urgency. The way you stand when you have been sitting in a particular chair for 3 years waiting for this exact moment, and you are not going to waste it by moving as if you are uncertain. She stood. She walked to the stage. The room shifted. Devlin started to rise from his seat. Reginald put one hand on his shoulder, not a grip, just a hand. The weight of a man who has already decided how this goes, resting on a shoulder that had not. Devlin sat back down. Dorothea watched Naomi cross the room with the expression of a woman running through her options. The social maneuver that will redirect this. The graceful intervention that will make it look like a misunderstanding. The elegant exit that preserves the evening. She was still looking for it when Naomi reached the podium. Naomi adjusted the microphone, looked out at 400 faces, and spoke in French. Not careful French, not studied French, not the French of someone who practiced for an occasion. The French of someone who was taught it before she could write her own name. Fluid, unhurried, with the warmth of Louisiana Creole in the bones of it. The warmth that Dorothea's correct and studied French had never once managed to produce. She said, "Thank you, Dorothea. That was a generous introduction, and I want to thank you sincerely for 3 years of speaking so freely in front of." The room went silent, not quiet, silent. The weight of 400 people understanding simultaneously that something has shifted and not yet knowing what to do with that understanding. She said, "I understood every dinner, every event, Every conversation at that table you believed was private because you believed I could not follow it. I understood when you described me as a decorative object. I understood when you told your guests I could not find my way through a museum. I understood when you called the language my grandmother raised me in the language her family carried across generations. The language of people who built something from nothing. I understood when you called it embarrassing. I wrote it down. The date, the time, the exact words, all of it. She paused. Let the silence do its work. Then she turned slightly toward a group of guests at the right side of the room and switched to Italian, clean, unhurried. The Italian of someone who spent real time in it and let it settle into her bones. She said, "It is a pleasure to speak with you directly this evening. We have been in the same room for 2 years and never had an actual conversation. I hope that changes." Back to English. Voice fuller now, not loud, just clear. The voice of a woman who has spent years being the quietest person in every room she entered and is finished with that particular discipline. She said, "My name is Naomi Carter. I hold a degree in French literature from Howard University, graduated with honors. I speak 4 languages, and I have been in this family's home, at this company's events, at this table, for 3 years, understanding everything said about me, to me, and around me, in every language it was said in." She opened the folder. The screen behind her changed. Bank statements, transfer records, emails with dates and names and figures, a paper trail assembled by someone who was inside the house and paying attention. The first email appeared. Subject, prenuptial execution strategy. The line visible to the entire room. She doesn't need to understand the terms. She just needs to sign. 400 people read it. 400 people understood it. And Dorothea Ashford, standing 3 feet from the podium she had vacated 6 minutes ago, looked at that screen and understood something she had not understood before tonight. Not just that she had been caught. That the entire architecture of the last 3 years, the careful construction of who Naomi was supposed to be, what she was supposed to know, what she was supposed to be capable of, had been built on an assumption that was wrong from night one. She had assumed Naomi could not see her. She had been seen from the very first dinner. Devlin stood up. Not because Reginald released him. He was up before Reginald could move them. He walked toward the stage and his face had the look of a man trying to perform composure, while composure is actively leaving the building. He said, "Naomi, stop." She looked at him. She said no, one word, flat and final. The word of a woman who has said yes to things she should have refused for long enough that saying no has become the most natural thing in the world. And something happened in Devlin Ashford that had not happened in his adult life. The script ran out. The version of himself he had been performing for 36 years, polished, positioned, always in possession of the right move, went quiet. Because the woman standing at his family's podium was not afraid of him. Not angry in a way he could manage. Not performing for sympathy. She was standing in the truth of what had happened and she was not moving. And he did not know what to do with that. He stood at the foot of the stage, looked at the screen, looked at the folder, looked at 400 people looking at him. Something crossed his face. Not redemption. Too late for that. Not absolution. He hadn't earned it, but something real. The expression of a man who has been choosing the easy version of himself for so long that he had almost forgotten there was another one. He said, "Everything she said is true." Still, he said, "I knew, and I chose wrong." He did not get back on the stage, did not try to take the microphone. He stepped back and stood in the space that the truth had cleared around him. A man-shaped gap where the performance used to be. Dorothea said, her voice controlled but no longer certain, "Someone remove her from this stage." No one moved. 400 people. And not one of them moved them. Because the power in this room, in this moment, was standing at the podium, in a red dress, with a folder of evidence in 4 languages and years of documented truth. And rooms like this follow power. That was the thing Dorothea had understood her whole life and had somehow, tonight, miscalculated. Reginald Farnsworth stood up. He did not go to the stage. He stood at his table and began to clap. Slowly, the sound of it carried the way slow applause always does, more weight than a rush of noise, more intention, more choice. 1 person joined, then 3, then a row, then the room opened up. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that the sound filled the ballroom and became its own kind of verdict. Not celebration, recognition. The sound of 400 people acknowledging, in the only way available to them in that moment, that they had just witnessed something true. Desmond Wells was already on his phone. Dorothea turned and walked toward the exit, not running. She did not run. She walked the way she had walked into every room for 62 years, upright, measured, controlled them. Except the exit was not where she expected it to be, or her legs were not cooperating the way she needed them to, because she stopped twice before she found the door and each stop cost her something visible. She found it finally, and she was gone. The story filed at 11:17 that night. By 4 in the morning it had been read 200,000 times. By noon the next day the number was closer to 1,000,000. 17 outlets picked it up within 24 hours. The headline was clean and unforgettable and did not need to embellish a single thing because the facts, laid out in Desmond's particular brand of precise and devastating prose, were embellishment enough. 2 of Ashford Wine Group's distribution partners issued statements before the end of the business day. One suspended the relationship pending review. One terminated outright with a press release that was 2 paragraphs long and had clearly been drafted by lawyers who understood the liability of staying attached to this story. The board convened Thursday. Dorothea was voted out of the foundation chairmanship Friday, unanimous, which meant Devlin had voted with them, which meant something had broken loose in him that the performance could no longer hold in place. Naomi was not in the building for any of it. She had driven to Adrian's office the morning after the gala, 8 o'clock, coffee in hand, the kind of morning that is very still and very clear after something large has passed through. Adrian did not offer pleasantries. She opened her laptop and began. The prenup challenge had been filed that morning. Grounds: fraud in the inducement, deliberate concealment of assets, documented intent to prevent independent legal review. Bernard's email was Exhibit A. The offshore account transfers were Exhibits B through F. Margaret Tibbs's written statement, 12 years of observation reduced to 4 notarized pages, was Exhibit G. Naomi said, "How long?" Adrian said, 3 weeks to the hearing. Maybe less. Naomi said, "And the asset argument?" Adrian said, "The offshore accounts established concealment predating the marriage. Combined with Bernard's email, the prenup does not survive them. The math on the settlement changes significantly when you count what was hidden." She looked at Naomi directly. She said, "You should know that what you built, the documentation, the consistency, the patience of it is what made this possible. I have handled cases with more money and better lawyers and lost them because the client didn't have what you have, which is a record so clean and so thorough that there is no daylight for them to work in." Naomi said, "My grandmother taught me to write things down." Adrian said, "Your grandmother is the reason you win this." She closed the laptop. She said, "Go home, not the mansion. Wherever home is for you right now." Naomi thought about it. She said, "I'll figure that out." She did. She found a sublet in Brooklyn. 2 rooms. Good light. A kitchen window that looked out over a garden that was somebody else's, but which she could see from her table in the mornings while she had coffee. It was the first space that had been entirely hers in 3 years. She moved in with 2 bags and the box from the closet and the red dress on a hanger, and nothing else she had not chosen herself. The first night she sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time. Not sad, not relieved exactly. Something quieter, the feeling of a room that is empty and belongs to you, which is a different thing than a room that is full and belongs to someone else. Told her about the sublet, the kitchen window, the garden she could see but not touch. Diane said, "Is it quiet?" Naomi said, "Very." Diane said, "Good, you've earned some quiet." The hearing was on a Tuesday. Naomi wore gray. Not because anyone suggested it. Because she had spent enough years dressing for the effect she had on other people's assumptions and was now dressing for herself. Gray was what she wanted, so gray it was. She sat in the hallway outside the courtroom for 38 minutes. Same posture she had held at 200 dinners where she was not supposed to matter. Back straight, hands still. Nothing in her face that she had not put there intentionally. Adrian came through the door at 11:40. She said, "Prenup is voided. Fraud in the inducement accepted in full. The offshore assets are included in the settlement calculation. We go back in 2 weeks for the final figures." Naomi said, "Okay." Adrian looked at her. She said, "That's all you've got? Okay?" Naomi said, "What else should I say? A beat." Adrian said, "Nothing, I suppose. You already said everything that needed saying, about 4 weeks ago, in front of 400 people. She almost smiled. Then she went back inside to finish the paperwork. Naomi walked out to the street. It was raining, light rain. The kind that does not require an umbrella but changes the quality of everything around it, makes surfaces shine, makes edges go soft, makes the world look briefly like a different version of itself. She stood on the courthouse steps and let it land on her face for a moment. Then she took out her phone. She called Reginald. He picked up on the first ring. She said, "It's done." He said, "All of it?" She said, "The foundation of it." A pause. Then he said, "I want to tell you something about why I stayed in that contract, why I kept coming back to that table and shaking that woman's hand and pretending everything was fine." She said, "You don't have to." He said, "I want to." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "My brother never got to see it. What happened the other night?" He spent 15 years building something and watched it get taken and rebranded and called innovation. And he died 4 years ago still carrying that, still thinking maybe he hadn't fought hard enough. Maybe he hadn't been smart enough. Maybe it was partly his fault. His voice didn't break, but it came close. He said, "What you did the other night." Them. Standing up there with all of it documented and all of it spoken out loud in the language they used to keep you small. That was for you, obviously. It had to be for you first. But I need you to know it was also for every person who sat at a table like that and swallowed what they were handed because they didn't have another option at the time. Naomi stood on the wet steps. She said, "I know. I just needed to say it." A pause. He said, "What happens next for you?" She said, "Howard." He said, "Teaching?" She said, "Building something. Something I've been thinking about for a while. A fellowship. Named after my grandmother. Language study, international business focus. For students from HBCU programs who don't have access to the kind of networks that open those doors automatically. Silence. Them. Then he said, "I want to be involved in that." She said, "I know you do." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you've been waiting to build something that lasts since before I met you. And this lasts." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes, it does." They stayed on the phone a little longer without saying much. And then they said goodbye, and she put the phone in her pocket and stood there in the light rain until the cold started to come through her coat. Then she went to find a cab. Dorothea did not make a public statement. She did not give interviews. She did not release a response through the family's communications team. She retreated to her sister's house in Maryland the week the board vote happened, and she stayed there. And the silence coming from that direction was, in its way, the loudest thing she had produced in years. Because Dorothea Ashford had built her authority on the certainty of her voice, on the assumption that she could speak and be heard and be obeyed. And now there was nothing left to say that anyone was interested in hearing. That was not nothing. That was in fact the consequence she had been protected from her entire life. Not legal consequence, though that was coming too. Bernard was facing a bar complaint, and the board had commissioned an independent review of the company's financial disclosures that would take months and would not end quietly. Not financial consequence, though that was real. The consequence that mattered was simpler and harder to recover from. She had stood in a room of 400 people and been wrong, completely, documentably, publicly wrong. About who Naomi was, about what Naomi knew, about the stability of the world she thought she had built. And everyone who had ever deferred to her certainty had watched it collapse in real time. That was the reckoning. Not dramatic, not loud. Just the slow settling of an edifice whose foundation had always been someone else's silence. The silence was over now. Devlin sold his stake in the family home 3 months after the gala. He moved into a rented apartment in the West Village, smaller than anything he'd lived in since college. He did not contest the prenup ruling. He did not fight the settlement figures when they came. His attorney had advised him to push back on several points, and he had said, clearly and without drama, that he would not be doing that. He called Celeste the week after the board vote. She did not pick up. He called again 2 weeks later. She still did not pick up. He left a voicemail the third time, 6 minutes long. She listened to it twice and did not call back immediately, but she did not delete it either. It sat in her phone like something she was not finished deciding about, which was, given everything, probably the most honest response available. Devlin had made his choices. They were documented. They were public. And the work of becoming someone different from the person who made those choices was his to do slowly, without shortcuts, in whatever privacy remained to him. He did not call Naomi. She had not expected him to. And she had nothing to say to him that had not already been said, in French, in front of 400 people, on a stage he had built his family's reputation on. That was sufficient. Celeste called Naomi in July. She said, "I went to Adrian, voluntarily. I gave a formal statement about what I witnessed inside the family, the conversations I was present for, the instructions I heard my mother give." Naomi said, "I know. Adrian told me." Celeste said, "I wanted to call and tell you myself." Naomi said, "I appreciate that a beat." Celeste said, "I should have done it sooner. I've been sitting with that for months, and I don't think I'll stop sitting with it for a while." Naomi said, "Probably not. But you did it when it mattered. That has to count for something." Celeste said, "Does it?" Naomi said, "Yes. It doesn't erase what you didn't do, but it's real, and it's yours. Hold on to it." They were quiet for a moment. Then Celeste said, "I don't know what I'm doing next. With the company, with everything. I don't know who I am outside of that family structure." Naomi said, "That sounds terrifying." Celeste said, "It is." Naomi said, "It's also the first honest thing you've had to figure out for yourself. That's not nothing." She did not offer more than that. It was not her role to guide Celeste through what came next. But it was true. And Celeste needed to hear something true from someone who had no reason left to manage her. They said goodbye. And Naomi sat in her Brooklyn kitchen, in her apartment with the garden she could see from the window, and thought about what it meant to leave people to the work that belonged to them. It was not indifference, it was respect. The belief that people were capable of their own reckonings if you stopped shielding them from the consequences of their choices. She hoped Celeste would do the work. She could not do it for her. The Diane Carter Language Fellowship was announced in September at a small ceremony in the dean's office at Howard University. Not a large event, not a press release. Just Naomi and the dean and Adrian and Reginald and 2 faculty members who had agreed to sit on the selection committee, and a phone call on speaker from a house in Louisiana, where an 81-year-old woman listened to the whole thing, without saying a word until it was over. The fellowship would fund 5 students per year, full tuition, in advanced language study with an international business focus. Students from HBCU programs who had the skill and the drive and had been told, in ways explicit and otherwise, that the rooms where global decisions were made were not meant for them. Naomi had built it to say, they are meant for you. Here is a door, and here is what you need to walk through it. The first recipient was announced in October, a 20-year-old from New Orleans. Not the Treme, but close. Close enough that Naomi felt the geography of it somewhere below language. She had learned French from her grandmother. She spoke 3 languages already. She had written in her application essay that language felt to her like the most important thing anyone had ever given her, because it was the one thing no one could take away without your permission. Naomi read that essay at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee going cold beside her. She read it once, then she put it down and sat there for a while, not crying, not laughing, something steadier than both, the feeling of a circle completing itself, of something that began in a small house with leaning floors and stacked French novels, and a grandmother who understood that the best thing you can give a child is not safety. Safety cannot be guaranteed but capability, the tools to build their own safety from the inside out. That was what Diane had given her, and that was what she was handing forward now. She called Reginald and told him about the essay. He said, send it to me. He called back 20 minutes later. He said, this girl is the whole point. She said, I know. He said, this is what my brother would have wanted. Not the board seat, not the recognition, them. Someone getting the door opened for them so they don't have to spend 15 years building a crowbar. Naomi said, yes. He said, you did good, Naomi. She said, we did good. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, did. She flew to New Orleans the following weekend. First time back in longer than she wanted to admit. The flight was short. The drive from the airport was familiar in the way that roots from childhood are familiar. Not because you consciously remember them, but because your body does. The turns already happening before your mind catches up. The house still leaned slightly to the right. Someone had replaced a board on the porch steps. Everything else was exactly as she had left it, including the books. Diane met her at the door. Smaller than Naomi remembered them. Which was its own kind of grief, not that her grandmother was smaller, but that Naomi kept being surprised by it. Kept measuring against the version of Diane that lived in her memory, and was always exactly the right size for the room she was standing in. They held each other in the doorway for a long time without speaking. Then Diane took her inside and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table the way they had sat at it 1,000 times before, and for a while they talked about nothing in particular. The neighbor's new dog. The bakery on the corner that had changed hands twice since Naomi left. The summer heat and how this year it had come early and stayed too long. Then Diane got up and went to the back bedroom. She came back with a box. Wooden, old. The kind of box that has been somewhere specific for a long time and carries the smell of that somewhere with it. She set it on the table between them. She said, I've been keeping these for the right time. I think this is the right time. Naomi looked at the box. She said, what is it? Diane said, open it. She did. Inside were letters, folded, handwritten in French, dozens of them, maybe more. Naomi picked up the top one and unfolded it and read the date. 4 years ago. Before the marriage. She looked at the second one. 3.5 years ago, the month before the wedding. The third, 3 years ago, 2 weeks after she moved into the mansion. She looked up at her grandmother. Diane said, I wrote to you every week. From the day you left for that life. Every week something I wanted to say, something I was thinking about, something I needed you to know. Naomi said, you didn't send them. Diane said, no. Naomi said, why? Diane looked at her with the steadiness of a woman who has had years to think about an answer and has arrived at one she believes. She said, because you needed to go through it the way you went through it. If I had been writing to you every week, you would have been writing back. And if you had been writing back, some part of you would have been here instead of there. And you needed to be all the way there. You needed to see all of it clearly and build all of it correctly without me in your ear. She paused, she said, But I needed to write them, so I did, and now you're out, and now you get to read them. Naomi looked down at the box. There were 163 letters. She counted them later, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her old bedroom, while the sounds of the neighborhood came in through the window. 163 weeks. More than 3 years of her grandmother sitting at this table in this kitchen, writing to her in French about whatever was on her mind, thoughts about language, about patience, about the specific kind of strength it takes to stay still when everything in you wants to move. She read until 2 in the morning. Then she lay on the narrow bed of her childhood and looked at the ceiling, and listened to the house settle around her the way it had always settled, the specific creaks and shifts of a structure that has been standing long enough to have its own vocabulary. She thought about the mansion on the Upper East Side, the marble floors that didn't creak, the ceiling so high that sound got lost before it reached you, the peonies every Monday in the vase she was not allowed to move, and she thought about this house. Leaning slightly right, floors that talked back. A grandmother in the next room who had been writing to her every single week for 3 years, and had trusted her enough not to send the letters. She knew which one had been a home. She had always known, she just hadn't been in a position to say so out loud. In the morning, Diane made breakfast and they ate together at the table with the box of letters between them. Neither of them talked about the letters directly. They talked around them the way you talk around something large that doesn't need to be explained because you both already understand it. After breakfast, Naomi helped wash the dishes. Then they sat on the porch on the chairs that had been there since Naomi was a child and looked at the street, the neighborhood going about its morning, cars and voices and a kid on a bicycle who was going too fast for the sidewalk and knew it. After a while, Diane said, in Creole, I have a question for you. Naomi said, ask. Diane said, did you use it well? Not a test, not a judgment. The question she had always asked, the one she had asked when Naomi left for Howard, when she got her degree, when she got on a plane to teach. The question that was not really a question but a compass. The thing Diane had trusted Naomi to use as a guide through everything that did not have a clear map. Naomi sat in her chair on the leaning porch of the house where she had learned that language is a door. She thought about 6 composition notebooks in a box under a floorboard. She thought about a balcony in April and a man named Reginald asking how long have you understood and her answering without turning around. She thought about a red dress on a hanger in the back of a closet, and a microphone, and 400 people going silent all at once. She thought about a 20-year-old from New Orleans who wrote in an essay that language was the one thing no one could take without your permission. She said, I used every door you gave me, grand-mère. Diane was quiet. Then she laughed, low and full and real. The laugh of a woman who is 81 years old and has lived long enough to see the things she planted grow into things she could not have imagined when she planted them. The laugh of someone who bet on a person a long time ago and has just received confirmation that the bet was right. She reached over and put her hand over Naomi's, left it there, and they sat on the porch together in the morning light, in the language they had always shared, in the neighborhood that had made Naomi everything she was, While the street went about its business and the kid on the bicycle came back around for another pass and the house held steady behind them, leaning slightly right, the way it always had, the way it always would, which was enough, which had always been enough.